of you have ever had a conversation with somebody that just totally got you, that you're just like, you're a combination of frustrated, you're a combination of like, I can't believe this conversation is going this direction. Anybody ever had a conversation like that? If you're not raising your hand, you're probably lying. It's a common thing in my house with a 6 and 3-year-old, let me tell you. It's common that I'm just like, what in the world are we doing here? Let me give you a story. Not too long ago, in the morning when the kids wake up, we allow them to go in and watch Right Now Media for a little bit while we kind of get ready. So I go in one morning and the kids are sitting there, they're watching Right Now Media. And I throw down their clothes and I say, hey, we're going to go today to go meet a friend, go to the park, and then have ice cream. Yeah, that's awesome. Excited, right? I say, okay, you have got to change clothes so we can go. I'm going to go get ready, and then we're going to go. Okay, yes. So I go get ready. I come back. They're sitting there in their pajamas still watching cartoons. Okay, here we go. Did you hear what I said? We need to be leaving right now, but you're sitting here watching cartoons still in your PJs. Oh, yeah. Okay, I'm going to go get some water bottles filled up with some water, and I'm going to get the car started, change clothes. When I get back, we're leaving. Okay. Go, come back. They're still sitting in PJs. What in the world? What is this? Okay, let me rehearse this. We're going to meet friends. Yes, this is good, right? We're going to go to the playground. This is good, right? And we're going to get ice cream, which is the best of all. Why are you still sitting in PJs? I don't know. I feel like this is the story that as we've been going through the prophets, right? God has said to his people, I'm going to give you all these good things. We're going to get some great stuff. All you have to do is just do what I say. And they say, I just want to watch cartoons, right? And we laugh because it's a reality. And the truth is, it's not just a kid thing. We do the same stuff, isn't it? God says, hey, I want to give you a lot of good things in your life. I want to bless your marriage. I want to bless your parenting. I want to bless your job. I want to provide for you. All I need you to do is just do what I say. And we say, you know what, God, I want to do it my way. I want to just sit here. It's the story of the prophets. It's the story of us. Today we're going to continue our series that we've been going through this summer in the minor prophets, and we're going to look at a guy named Micah. If you want to turn to Micah. And Micah's going to talk to Israel and Judah like a lot of the other prophets we've talked to about. The story doesn't change, does it? I guarantee you next week I will have the same conversation with my kids. And God has the same conversation with us time and time again. We talked about last week with Jonah that one of the things that we can appreciate about our God is he's a God of second chances. Well, I think with us, he's a God of 100, 1,000, 1,000,000 chances. What we're going to do today is we're going to cover 4 things. First, we're going to talk about the history of the book. Then we're going to talk about the kind of the overview, how it's broken down. And then we're going to talk about some prophecy. Micah is one of the most prophetic books in the Old Testament, so we're going to look at a couple of the different prophecies that Micah gives. And then finally, to wrap up, we're going to camp down in one passage that I think will speak to us and give us a very good understanding of the central message of the prophet of Micah. So in verse 1 of chapter 1, we begin. It says, the word of the Lord came to Micah of Moresheth in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, which he saw concerning Samaria, and Jerusalem. Now, unlike most of the prophets we've looked at, where it says he is Jonah, son of Amittai, or it usually tells us who the father's name was, what family they came from. With Micah, it doesn't tell us. It just tells us where he's from. Now, Micah's name means who is like Yahweh, or who is like God. And I think this is a really crucial question for us, isn't it? Have you ever gotten up in the morning and really thought about that? As you think about all the things that you have in that day, all the errands you have to run, all the responsibilities you have you ever just stopped to think, who is like our God? If you will do that, it will put a lot of things into perspective. We'll start to think that no one is like our God. And so all the things that we put on ourselves to do, how should they stack up to God and what God has called us to do? As we look at our map that we've been talking through, we see that Micah is from the southern kingdom of Judah. That's where he's from. But the message that he's going to give us is going to be for both the southern kingdom of Judah and also the northern kingdom of Israel. All the other prophets that we've talked about so far, they've spoken to one or the other. Micah's the first one that's going to take both of them to task. Now, Micah was a contemporary of a guy named Isaiah. Anybody ever heard of Isaiah? Okay, they were bros. They hung out together. They knew each other. They were both from Jerusalem area, and they were contemporaries. Isaiah started his ministry in 739 BC. Micah prophesied in the period of 735 to 700. So they were talking at the same time. And Isaiah's primary audience was the ruling class, whereas Micah's primary audience was the workers, the nobles, the normal people in the town. So Isaiah was speaking to these people. Micah's speaking to the people that are the everyday people at the same time. And one of the really cool things is that when you look at the prophet Micah and you look at the prophet Isaiah, they say a lot of the same thing. I want to give you some passages that you can go home and look at later that are echoing, where Isaiah will echo what Micah says. In Micah 4:1, you compare that to Isaiah 2, verses 2 through 4. In Micah 4:10, you compare that to Isaiah 39:6. In Micah 5:2 and 3, you can compare that to Isaiah 9:6 and 7. In Micah 5:6, you can compare it to Isaiah 14:25. And in Micah 7:12, you can compare it to Isaiah 11:11. So there's a lot of similarities between these two prophets in what they say, which gives us even more confidence in the message. Now, up until this point in time, we've been talking about these prophets that were in the early 8th century. And they were in Israel, they were under Jeroboam II. He was the king of Israel at that time. And down in Judah, it was under Uzziah and Jotham. Now, you might remember that we talked about during this period, the early part of the 8th century, Israel was strong. They had a strong military. They were rich. Countries came to them. They took over countries. But they had become very much involved in idolatry and worshiping the gods of the foreign countries, and especially in Assyria. You might remember a few weeks ago we talked about the prophet Amos. And the prophet Amos, he spoke very much about the condemnation of Israel because of their treatment of the poor. Now, this is going to come full circle. By the time Micah prophesies, in the late 8th century, we're in a different ballgame now. Israel and Judah are now in chaos because of corrupt kings that have taken over. Whereas we talked about in the first half of the 8th century, Assyria really being a nobody, they were weak. Assyria has now become somebody. That little brother has grown up, and now they're really powerful, and they're coming. And so that's where we see King Ahaz is on the throne during Micah's time. And King Ahaz is one of the most famous kings of Judah. But it's not for good reasons. He was one of the most wicked people to ever live. And during this time, his wickedness led Israel and Judah to become very rebellious against God. They became very cruel. They became very greedy. They would punish their own people. And in Ahaz's wickedness, he decided it would be a good idea to form a treaty with Assyria, which God told him not to do. And Assyria said, sure, we'll be your protection. That didn't work out very well. So Ahaz dies, and his son Hezekiah takes the throne in Judah. And Hezekiah has to deal with all the problems that have been passed down to him by his evil father. Anybody ever had to deal with the ramifications of your family members in the past? Yeah. It's not a lot of fun, is it? And Hezekiah tries to rebel against Assyria. And he tries to pull Judah away from Assyria's bondage. And they don't like that very much. And so in 701 BC, they make their trek through Judah. And they crush Judah all the way to the doorsteps of Jerusalem. And God says, stop. You don't get Jerusalem. But along that path, they have decimated the whole country of Judah. And this is the time frame that Micah is speaking in. And so, you might remember throughout the prophets, many of them, there's a 3-point pattern that they go through. The first point of the pattern is that God says to either Israel or Judah that you've broken the covenant that we have, the Mosaic covenant that we established after I brought you out of Egypt. You've broken it, and you need to repent. The second part of that is when God says to them, okay, Israel and Judah, you're choosing not to repent. So now I'm going to have to punish you. But because he is the God that we worship and the God who forgives and is full of grace and hope, the third point is that he will tell them that there is a future redemption, there is a future hope for you because of my grace when you repent. So you're still going to feel the wrath, you're still going to get punished, but because I'm gracious, there will be hope for you in the future. And so as we look at the way Micah is structured, it's broken into 3 different sections. The first section of the book is chapters 1 through 3. And in chapters 1 through 3, God is going to tell Judah and Israel that your destruction is imminent because you are so sinful. And in these 3 chapters, he's going to call out different groups of people. And I got to tell you, as I was studying this and reading this, my heart just sank. Because as I'm reading this, you're reading about Israel and you're reading about Judah in the early 8th centuries. But I feel like I'm reading about America as I read these. God tells them that he's going to judge the greedy. Now, for a lot of us, we hear that word and we turn our ears off and we go, well, I'm not greedy. The only person that thinks they're greedy is rich people and Michael Douglas in the movie Wall Street, right? I'm not greedy. Greed is not about how many zeros are in your bank account. It's about where your heart is. You can be dirt poor and be greedy. It's all about where you have placed your priority in life. Are you trusting in money or are you trusting in God? And the people of Israel and Judah had placed all their faith in their wealth because they thought God had provided for them, so, hey, we can live it up. But God said no, that I'm going to judge you for your greed. He also said, I'm going to judge those who abuse the helpless. And the helpless that he's going to talk about are three different groups. The first is the refugee, the person that was coming to seek shelter from oppression in another country. But what was happening is they were coming to Israel and Judah to seek refuge, but instead they were receiving persecution and hardship. They were being mistreated because they were vulnerable and you could. The second group was those that were abusing the physically handicapped, those who couldn't physically take care of themselves. And the primary audience that he's talking about in Micah was former soldiers who had fought for their country, had become injured in battle, and their country wasn't taking care of them. They were letting them go, saying, take care of yourself. We're not worried about you. And God hated that. The third group was vulnerable women and children. They were the most vulnerable. They could be taken into slavery, prostitution. They could be made to beg. No one cared about them. And God cares extremely about women and children. And so he was mad that they were abusing women and children and forcing them into sex slavery in order to pay their masters. He also was upset with the leaders of Israel and Judah. He was upset that they didn't care about the people in their country like they had been told to. All they cared about was themselves, their power, their status. They didn't care about the normal people in their country. And the final group that he calls out were the prophets and the spiritual leaders. See, what they had done is they had decided that, hey, this is a great way to make money. They were the early televangelists. They were the early prosperity gospel guys. If you would go and you would give a prophet money, he would tell you great things. God is going to bless us. If you didn't, God is going to punish you. And what did this do to the nation? It had caused them to doubt and have a wrong perception of who God is, much like we see today. In chapters 4 and 5 is the second section. And this is a really exciting section because in this section, God is going to announce a future hope with a new Messiah. God is going to announce that one day he will set up his millennial kingdom with a new king, and he will renew the land of Israel. In this new kingdom, there will be no more war. There will be peace. There will be security for Israel. In this new kingdom, there will be no more idolatry. Everyone will worship the true God. This is what the promise is for them in the future. Obviously, this is still future. It has not happened yet. But this is part of what God will institute during his millennial kingdom. In chapters 6 and 7, we find the final section of Micah. And in this section, we find a plea for repentance from the people so that they can find true deliverance. Just as the other prophets had shown, you might remember in Hosea that we talked about, God is going to take Israel and Judah to court. There's this heavenly courtroom that God sets up. And he's going to lay out for Israel and Judah how they have broken the Mosaic covenant. And he's going to go about telling them how over the years, starting with their deliverance from Egypt, he has provided for them time and time and time again. But all Israel and Judah were willing to do was to come to him with sacrifices that he didn't even want or care about, because they thought, well, we'll just buy our way into God's favor. We'll just give him sacrifices and he will be happy with what we gave him. And so in the final chapter, chapter 7, Micah's going to lament the coming judgment, the destruction that they will face. But in the final verses, he will once again give them hope that God will one day restore his people. He will rebuild their cities, reclaim their lands, just as he had made the promise to Abraham and Jacob in Genesis. So that's the overview of Micah. Now, one of the really cool things about the book of Micah is there is a lot of prophecy located in this book. And so I want to just look at a couple different ones of the prophecies that we can find. The first one's found in chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. And this prophecy is going to be about the fall of Samaria in 722. Now you can find the story of the fall of Samaria in 2 Kings 17, 5 through 6. But Samaria, remember, is the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. So northern kingdom, Israel, Samaria is the capital. Southern kingdom, Judah, Jerusalem is the capital. So this is about the fall of Samaria. In verses 6 and 7 it says, "Therefore I will make Samaria a heap in the open country, a place for planting vineyards. And I will pour down her stones into the valley and uncover her foundations. All her carved images shall be beaten to pieces. All her wages shall be burned with fire, and all her idols will be laid waste. For from the fee of a prostitute she gathered them, and to the fee of a prostitute they shall return." So Samaria, the capital of Israel, the capital of the northern kingdom, they had prostituted themselves to false gods. And what God is telling them is, you have prostituted yourself to false gods, and now through a pagan nation, I'm going to take everything from you. All that you wanted, you're going to get in spades by the people that you chose to form an alliance with. The second prophecy comes just a few verses later in verses 9 through 16. And this is going to talk about that invasion of Judah in 701 by Assyria. It says, "For her wound is incurable. As it has come to Judah, it has reached to the gate of my people, to Jerusalem. Tell it not in Gath, weep not at all. In Beth-Lehophram, roll yourselves in the dust. Pass on your way, inhabitants of Shaphir, in nakedness and shame. The inhabitants of Zanin do not come out. The lamentation of Beth-Azel shall take away from you its standing place. For the inhabitants of Moroth wait anxiously for good, because disaster has come down from the Lord to the gates of Jerusalem. Harness the steeds to the chariots, inhabitants of Lachish. It was the beginning of sin to the daughter of Zion. For in you were found the transgressions of Israel. Therefore you shall give parting gifts to Moresheth Gath. The houses of Achbib shall be a deceitful thing to the kings of Israel. I will again bring a conqueror to you, inhabitants of Mareshah. The glory of Israel shall come to Adullam. Make yourselves bald and cut off your hair, for the children of your delight. Make yourselves as bald as an eagle, for they shall go from you into exile." So what we see in these verses is Micah is describing the pathway that Assyria is about to take as they come through the whole country of Judah. And he uses wordplay with each one of these cities. It's one of the things, the poetic things that Micah does, is he uses wordplays. Let me give you a couple examples. In each of the cities, the name of the city meant something. So one is Beth Orphra. And what that word means is house of dust. So when he says his verse, he says, literally, the house of dust, roll yourself in dust. Now, rolling yourself in dust was extreme mourning for these people. So what he is telling them is you are about to experience the most extreme mourning that you can ever imagine. You will literally roll yourself in the dust of the ground. You are so upset about what's about to happen. Another one, lachish. In Hebrew, that word sounds like the phrase team of steeds. So when you read that verse, it says, harness the steeds to the chariots, inhabitants of the team of steeds. And the interesting thing is that instead of war horses, these are running horses to help them get out of the way of the Assyrians. Now let me give you a modern day example that might help you understand this a little bit better. It's as if God said, I'm going to grind Little Rock into tiny pebbles. So he takes the name and he uses it as a phrase. In 1 Samuel 22:1, we see that this same pathway was used by David as he fled from Saul, as Saul was hunting David. It's the same pathway. Now, this pathway would have been traumatic for Micah as he's preaching this to the people of Judah, because he was from this area. And so when he is talking to them about the destruction coming, he knows very well that his family and his friends will be part of this massacre. They will die. Have any of you ever had to tell somebody that you care about something hard? Anybody ever had to do that? In college, one of my very best friends, we'd been friends since we were little, he got engaged. And I got to know his fiance, and I had to go to him and I said, man, you shouldn't do this. She's not who you need to marry. You can probably imagine how that went over. Not very well. Caused some strain in our relationship for a while. But after a while, he called it off before he got married. And he's still to this day, this is 20 plus years later, still tell me thank you for saying that. But it was not fun at the time to tell your best friend, you don't need to be marrying her. It's not a fun thing to tell somebody things that they need to hear because sometimes they can't hear it. And that's what Micah had to do. He had to tell his people, his family, his friends something really hard. That Assyria is about to come through. He's going to crush everybody. The next prophecy is found in 3:12. And this is about the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem that the Babylonians would do in 586. It says, therefore, because of you, Zion shall be plowed as a field. Jerusalem shall become a heap of ruins, and the mountain of the house a wooded height. Now this verse, he's talking about how the injustice and the violence that it took to build Jerusalem and the temple was going to come back on them in the future through the Babylonians. And what's really interesting is several hundred years later, the prophet Jeremiah would prophesy this same thing against Jerusalem. And Jeremiah was arrested for saying that God is going to punish them and he's going to destroy the temple. And so they arrested Jeremiah and they brought him before the leaders. And they were going to condemn Jeremiah to death because he had spoken evil against Jerusalem and the temple of God. But there were some brave men that day that said, wait a second, hold on. Jeremiah is saying the same thing the great prophet Micah said to King Hezekiah. And they let him live because King Hezekiah believed what God said. And so because of Micah, they let Jeremiah go. It's really an interesting story in the book of Jeremiah. 410 is the next prophecy. In 586, when Babylon came in and they destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, they took the people captive and they took them into exile. And so Micah says, "Writhe and groan, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in labor, for now you shall go out from the city and dwell in the open country. You shall go to Babylon. There you shall be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies." God told the people in 586, when Babylon comes, you need to go. That's your only chance to be rescued, was to go into exile. In 4:1-8, we see the prophecy of the return of these people, not only from captivity, but the future peace of Israel. In verse 1, it says, "It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and the people shall flow to it. And many nations shall come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many peoples, and shall decide disputes for strong nations far away. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. But they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree. And no one shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. For all the peoples walk each in the name of its God, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. In that day, declares the Lord, I will assemble the lame and gather those who have been driven away and those who have been afflicted. And the lame I will make the remnant, and those who are cast off a strong nation. And the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion from this time forth and forever. And you, O tower of the flock, hill of the daughter of Zion, to you it shall come. The former dominion shall come, kingship for the daughter of Jerusalem. See, Jerusalem and its temple were going to be destroyed. But one day, in God's millennial kingdom, he would reestablish it as the center of where God's word would flow out to the nations. Instead of the nations coming in to hear the word of God would flow out to the people. The last prophecy I want to talk to you about is probably the most famous that many of you know. It's found in 5:2. This is the prophecy that predicts the birth of Jesus Christ in Bethlehem. It says, "But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth from me one who is the ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient of days." Now in 1 Samuel 17:12, we learn that this same Bethlehem was the birthplace of King David. So King David, the greatest king in Israel's history, was born in this same town. Now Bethlehem was a small town. It was of nothing. So that the fact that a king like King David would be born in Bethlehem was a miracle in and of itself. But the fact that the King of Kings, the eternal King, would come from this is amazing. We learn that in Matthew 2:6, it says, O you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who shall shepherd my people Israel. This was the verse that the wise men from the east used to know that Jesus was going to be born in Bethlehem. So Micah, in 700 BC, 700 years later, the wise men from the east, who were not Christians, they were pagans, but they had read the prophet Micah, and they knew to come to Bethlehem because that was where the new king would be born. It's an amazing book with amazing stories. As we wrap up this morning, I want to focus in on what I think is the central passage of this book. If you'll turn to chapter 6, verse 6. Beginning in verse 6, it says, With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? This is an amazing question that each of us have to ask ourselves. Every day, as we think about what is ahead of us in the day, what should we bring before our God? What do we have to bring to Him as we go about our day? This is the God of all creation. This is the God who has sent His only Son, Jesus Christ, to come and to die for our sins. He's the one that has gifted us with all of the blessings that we have. Our family, our health, our homes, our children, our jobs. What do we have to bring before Him every day as act of worship? Some will answer the way he answers in the next verse. Shall I come before Him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? What can you bring? What's the least we can bring, they're asking. Do some of you come before God and say, you know what, God? I'm kind of busy. My job takes a lot of my time. I've got family responsibilities. My kids have activities that we've got to participate in. We've got vacations we need to go on. We've got yard work we need to do. God, I'm pretty busy. But you know what? I'm here now. Aren't you happy? You've gotten a little piece of me. You got the least I can give you, but you got some. Are you happy? That's how some people come before God. They say, God, aren't you pleased with the fact that I gave you anything? I got all these other things that keep me busy, all these important things. But God, you know what? I gave you something. Be proud of me. Pat me on the back. Bless me because I gave you a little bit of something. Maybe you're on the flip side. You're like the next people. Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with tens of thousands of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgressions, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Maybe you think God's pleased with you because you give a lot of money here, or you serve a lot. Maybe you think He's pleased with you because, you know what, my kids are involved in the children's ministry here. I'm doing my part to make sure my kids know God. He's not pleased with that either. It doesn't matter if you give Him just the bare minimum or you give Him everything you got if it's not for the right reasons. Next verse, has He told you, O man, what is good? And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. This is pretty important. It's so important, Jesus even thought it was important. In Matthew 23:23, Jesus will summarize Micah. He'll say to the Pharisees and scribes, the religious leaders of the day, he'll say, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others." You see, we've got many people in this country that love the concept of justice. They love it. As long as it can stay abstract, right? It's a whole nother ball game when you do what it says, do justice. Like, I want justice for people, but am I willing to get out of my comfort zone in order to be a part of a solution to do justice? We also have a lot of people who like strictly the idea of justice. And that's all that they care about. Take any issue you want. Immigration. You know what? All I care about is that we have laws, we have borders. If you come across, you've broken the law, you go to jail or you go back. That's all I care about. Racial issues. We've got a minority and a police officer involved in an accident, somebody dies. It's that person's fault. They should have listened to the cop. They should have done what they were supposed to do, and they wouldn't end up hurt or dead. It's their fault. Healthcare. You know what? Figure it out yourself. That's your problem. Get a good job that'll offer you health care. You know what? You got cancer and you have $1 million bill? Tough luck. Sorry for you. It's justice. Education. I'm really sorry that your school system is terrible. Move. Like, that's easy. Find someplace else to go. We've got a lot of people that are like that. You can go on and on about the list. All they care about is, here's the law, here's justice, this is what we do. Now we've got other people on the other end. They say, all I care about is love, kindness, and I want to have mercy. Got somebody trying to cross the border? Who cares if we have laws and we have rules? These people are coming and they're hurting, and all we should care about is that they're hurting, and that's what matters. Cop and a minority get into it, the cop's at fault. Automatically, the cop's at fault. They're racist. That's the default, isn't it? Healthcare. We should provide healthcare to everybody. It's a human right. Doesn't matter if they can't afford it, everybody should have it. Education. Everybody should have it. It's a human right. Don't worry. And we have set up in this country these two poles that you got to be in one of them, right? You turn on the news every day, and that's all they do. They fight over these two poles. You're either this or you're this. You're either a justice or you care about people. There's no middle ground in our country anymore. But that's not what God called us to, is it? See, they like to leave out the last part. Because we can't do this if we don't do what the rest of Micah says and what the rest of Jesus says. We can't do justice, we can't love kindness and mercy if we're not willing to walk humbly with our God. If we're not willing to be faithful to Him, we can't help but live in these two polar extremes. And they fight all the time because we're not being faithful to our God. Now, does that make the problems easy? No, it doesn't. But instead of jumping in with both feet at the first sign of a fracas, we'd be able to step back and we say, okay, how would God want us to handle these things? How would the God that loves us, that loves every single person, want us to handle these things? Not jump in with both feet and say it's your fault or your fault, but how can we say that we want to be peaceful mediators in a fight? Isn't that what God has called us to be? It's not possible unless you're willing to be faithful and walk humbly with our God. You will always live on the poles. You will constantly fight the tension of this world, of this fallen world, if you're not willing to step back and say, I have to walk humbly with my God. I may not have all the answers, but you know what? I care about doing justice, and I care about people. How can we make these two reconcile? Only through the cross can that happen. As a parent, I deal with this every day, right? Don't we all? I can do justice, right? You did not do what I asked you to do. I can bring justice. Or I can walk with compassion and kindness and we never get anything done, right? We've got to be able to walk this middle road that only we can do through Christ. If you're here this morning and this is like crazy talk to you, that's okay. What I want to invite you to do today is to call out to God and ask Jesus to come into your life and to change your heart and change your mind so that you can understand this. Even when it's hard, that you can understand it's possible because of Jesus Christ. Micah gives us a great message. We don't have to live on the poles. We don't have to be this way or this way. We can come into the middle and bridge the gap and be who Christ has called us to be in this world that all we want to do is see wars go on amongst each other. Christ has called us to love our neighbors. And the way we do that is by loving him and following him. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you for this morning. I thank you for Micah, for his message. As hard as it is, and as confusing it is in our times where there is constant fighting, and you're either this way or you're that way. There's no middle ground. Lord, we thank you that through you, there is. We can do justice, and we can also love kindness and mercy, and be faithful and humble, not thinking we have to have all the answers because we know that you care. And so, Lord, I pray that as we enter back into our time of worshiping you through song, that you would just work in our lives right now, that you would speak to us on how this applies to our lives and how as we go back into our day-to-day lives, this affects us. If you need time to pray, if you need somebody to pray for you, come up front. I'll be happy to pray for you. If you are a follower of Jesus Christ and you want to take communion, there's communion on both sides where you can come and just thank God for sending his son. Thank Jesus for his sacrifice for you. Whatever you need to do right now, don't worry about what people think. Do what God's calling you to do. Be obedient to him, not to the world. Amen.